What if I told you that the great stories of Westeros are written not only in blood and fire, but in the quiet whisper of unseen things? We will delve into those very moments left off screen. A silent rebellion woven from a single thread, and the last quiet night before the storm. Write in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, get comfortable. Imagine the northern wind howling outside your window, a fire crackling in the hearth, and we begin. Imagine that the fate of hundreds of lives depends on the last handful of grain. Sounds like something out of an epic saga, doesn't it? Well, that's exactly the reality Jon Snow faced on the wall. We're used to seeing him with a sword in hand, in the heat of battle, where every blade stroke measures life or death. But the true struggle for the survival of the Night's Watch, far more merciless and exhausting, often happened not on blood-soaked fields, but in the quiet of an office, to the scratch of a quill and the rustle of parchment. And it's there, to the coldest and harshest corner of Westeros, that we journey today, to look at the burden of a leader through the lens of the mundane and the desperate. Imagine yourself in the heart of Castle Black, far north in Westeros, where the very air feels like steel, pierced by an eternal, relentless winter. Beyond the thick, ancient stone walls, built millennia ago and layered with ice, a furious wind rages. It carries not only icy snowflakes, but also the chilling horror of unknown lands, where, it's whispered, ancient, unimaginable forces have awakened. This wind seeps into every crack, every fissure of the old fortifications, making the weathered wood groan and the massive stones moan as if alive. Even inside, in the few rooms still warmed by meager wood supplies, the cold penetrates to the bone, drawing out the last vestiges of warmth. Breaths condense into tiny clouds of vapor, vanishing into the frigid air. The gloomy halls of Castle Black, which once hummed with life, laughter, curses, and the noise of hundreds of brothers, now stand almost unbearably desolate and silent. This silence is not peace, not quiet solitude. It presses down on the shoulders like a heavy blanket of snow and ice, seeping into every crevice, every stone, every corner of the mind. It is the silence of a harbinger, the silence of a hungry beast waiting for its moment beyond the wall, ready to devour all living things. Even footsteps seem to lose their echo in this oppressive stillness, absorbed by the ancient stones that have witnessed so much despair, so many sacrifices, so much senseless bravery. Here, in this borderland where civilization ends and wilderness, and something worse, begins, every breath, every heartbeat feels deafeningly loud and significant. And in this deafening silence, in a small, dimly lit room that served as his study, sits Jon Snow, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. He is not dressed in heavy armor. His sword, Longclaw, rests in its scabbard by the wall, its hilt gleaming dully in the light of a single candle. Today, his weapon is not steel, but a slender goose quill. And his battlefield is not blood-soaked fields, but yellowed, brittle parchment, covered in tiny figures, lines, and symbols that will decide who lives another day and who does not. This is a far more insidious and merciless enemy than 100 wildlings or even a regiment of Lannister soldiers. This is an enemy that cannot be defeated with a sword, cannot be pierced with a dagger. This is an enemy composed of simple yet deadly mathematics, from which there is no escape. The air in the room is thick, heavy, saturated with smells. each telling its own not-so-cheerful story. The scent of old, damp wood, permeated by thousands of winters, carrying echoes of countless fires, human sorrows, and despair. The bitter, sharp, almost metallic smell of ink mixes with the light, sweet bitter scent of wax from the flickering candle, which rapidly melts, shortening with each passing minute. And most importantly, a faint but persistent aroma of grain, dried herbs, and salted meat. These are the smells of life, but there is too little of them. So desperately, catastrophically little, and they are melting away like snow in the palm of your hand in spring, leaving behind only emptiness and the promise of inevitable, all-consuming need. Dampness pervades everything, even on the parchment pages before Jon. Its icy, penetrating touch can be felt. Jon leans over the table, illuminated only by the dim, flickering light of a single candle that desperately battles the shadows cast into the corners of the room, making them even deeper and more sinister. Its flame wavers, casting peculiar, dancing shadows on his haggard face, on his sharp cheekbones, on his stubbornly tight lips. Dark circles under his eyes betray sleepless nights spent in anxiety and agonizing reflection, rather than deserved, restorative rest. His usually inquisitive gaze is now focused, almost mechanically gliding over the lines, trying to catch every detail, every tiny change, every nuance. His hand, accustomed to gripping the hilt of a sword in battle or on the training ground, his fingers, calloused from sword and bow, now slowly, with incredible effort and care, draws figures, as if each stroke of the quill could change the course of fate, as if this is his last hope. The scratch of the quill on the stiff parchment, dry, scratching, piercing, almost unbearable, is the only sound breaking the oppressive, crushing silence. It is a sound that speaks of a struggle, more subtle, but no less brutal than any clash of blades. It is a sound in which despair and unwavering determination merge into one. He turns the pages, each one not just a record, but a chapter in the story of slow, relentless depletion. This isn't just an inventory. It's a dissection of a dying organism, a slow recognition of the inevitable. He sees the numbers, sacks of grain, growing fewer and fewer, their bottom already looming. Barrels of salted meat, their rows thinning at an alarming rate, leaving only emptiness and the smell of salt. Bundles of dried fish, long unreplenished, their quantity evoking only bitterness. Small bags of withered vegetables and healing herbs, each seeming more precious than gold. Their contents the last specks of hope. Every digit, every word, is not just a numerical value. It is someone's life, someone's pain, someone's hope. This is the energy that sustains the watchmen on the wall, whose posts on icy heights allow them no moment of relaxation, where frostbite lurks around every corner. This is strength for the builders, who repair the damage caused by time and freezing, restoring what crumbles under the onslaught of the elements, their hands perpetually red with cold. This is meager food for the cooks, who try to make something, anything, from these scarce remains, to maintain the brothers' spirits, to give them even a tiny illusion of fullness. And it is hope for all the others, for the sick, for the wounded, for those who can no longer serve, but are still part of the watch, part of its unbearable responsibility. Jon remembers how recently Castle Black's storerooms were full. Vivid, almost phantom images flash in his mind of arriving caravans, laden to capacity with provisions, when wagons creaked under the weight of sacks of golden grain, barrels of fragrant wine and tart ale, crates of dried fish and smoked meat, whose scents filled the air. Every year, caravans from the southern lands, from the fertile reaches of the Reach and Westeros, brought new supplies, new hopes for survival. Those times seemed unshakable, eternal, but those times are gone. The war that shattered the kingdoms into countless fragments and diverted all attention. The winter that proved far longer and harsher than predicted, and the endless, growing threat from the north, consuming all attention and resources, have dried up these streams to the last trickle. Now, every provision, every tiny resource, whether a handful of grain or a bundle of dried herbs, is worth its weight in gold or even dragonglass. Days of abundance have long passed, giving way to the harsh, merciless reality of hunger and deprivation that presses down on everyone. He traces a numb finger along the line, indicating the quantity of barley. There was so much that sacks stood 3 rows high to the ceiling, concealing it. Now, there's barely enough for a couple of weeks for the entire garrison, if they're fed minimally, reducing rations to the most pitiful, barely life-sustaining portions. And how many men are in the watch? Fewer than there once were in Lord Commander Mormont's single company alone, when the watch numbered thousands. Just a meager handful, scattered across abandoned, dilapidated castles along the wall. Barely a vanishing point on a vast canvas. But these few are all that remain. This is his family, his brothers, and he is responsible for each of them, for their lives, for their souls, for their future, if there even is one. This is a responsibility that weighs heavier than any armor, heavier than 1,000 swords. It is a burden he alone carries. He puts aside one scroll, its edges frayed from countless touches, and picks up another, rolled and tied with a thin, in places decayed, string that barely holds. He unrolls it with particular care, so as not to damage the fragile parchment. This is the consumption list. How much is eaten per day? How much is needed just to survive, so as not to drop dead from hunger? And the numbers don't add up, never add up. Consumption is always higher than receipts. It's just mathematics. Cruel, merciless mathematics of survival that recognizes no excuses, no justifications, no mercies. It simply is, and it is relentless, like winter itself. Jon doesn't just look at these soulless figures. He feels them with every cell of his exhausted body, which has long forgotten rest. He sees in them not dry columns, but living, suffering faces, their shadows dancing before his eyes. He sees the fat cook Dolly, whose hands, once nimble and strong, now tremble from fatigue and cold, trying his best to make the meager broth even somewhat hearty, adding the last, barely discernible remnants of dried mushrooms and onions gathered last summer. He sees the tired faces of the sentries on the wall, their cheeks covered in frostbite, their lips cracked and bleeding from the cold, who need every bit of warmth and energy to withstand the icy wind that pierces them to the very bones. He sees the young brothers who are not yet strong, whose bodies are not yet fully grown, and who need every morsel of food for growth, to withstand the harsh conditions of service without perishing in the first winter. And then he sees others, those who are already weak, whose eyes have dulled, whose movements have become slow and hesitant, almost ghostly, those who cough incessantly and shiver, whose bodies can no longer fight the cold and hunger, whose illnesses progress daily, draining their strength. He knows that for them, every unreceived piece of food is not just hunger. It is a step toward the abyss, to sickness, to death by exhaustion, which creeps in unnoticed, like a shadow in twilight. This is not just statistics. These are sentences he must pass, decisions that will forever rest on his conscience. He remembers his days ranging beyond the wall, when he himself nearly froze to death, when hunger was a constant companion, when every root found, every mouse caught, was a true feast, talked about later with bated breath. He knows what it's like when your stomach cramps, when every bone in your body aches from cold and exhaustion, when your mind blurs from lack of strength, when all you want to do is just fall down and sleep forever. He remembers how hard it was to move, how thoughts became muddled, how hope faded with each passing hour. And now, he must decide who will experience this again and who will not. Who will feed themselves only with memories of food, and who will get a chance at tomorrow. This is not merely resource management. It is manipulation of destinies, juggling lives, where every wrong move can be fatal. He picks up a small, worn pouch of dried herbs. The fabric of the pouch is stiff and rough, and through it seeps a faint, almost forgotten scent of rosemary, thyme, and some wild mint, probably gathered last summer, when the greenery was lush and generous, and the world seemed less hostile. This aroma fills the air, offering a momentary illusion of freshness, of summer, of warmth, but only for a moment. But these herbs are not for taste, not for pleasure. They are not meant to bring joy. They are for medicine, to somehow fight scurvy, which creeps in unnoticed, decimating the watch's ranks, with the relentless suffocating cough, with the fevers that so often visit Castle Black in winter, taking the weak one by one into the embrace of eternal sleep. But there are too few of them too. Too few. Will there be enough? For how many days? For how many people? Every gram of this dry herb, every stem, is potential relief for someone suffering, and perhaps even someone's life that could have been saved, but won't be. Jon feels their weight in his hand. Insignificant, yet incredibly, unbearably heavy, like all his burden. Jon sighs, the sound seeming deafening in the absolute, oppressive silence, breaking its ominous calm like a stone thrown into a pond. He closes his eyes, trying for a moment to escape the merciless reality, the numbers that burn his eyes, the burden that weighs on his soul. Imagine the weight of this decision. This is not a choice between honor and dishonor, not a choice between life and death in open battle, where strength and courage decide the outcome, and victory brings relief. This is a choice between who will receive enough food to continue fighting, to hold a sword, to stand on guard, to survive, and who will be condemned to a slow, agonizing death from hunger and disease, from exhaustion that slowly drains life from within. This is the most terrible kind of war, where the enemy is unseen, invisible, yet its presence is felt in every creak of the floorboards, in every cold draft that chills to the bone, in every sigh of exhausted people, in their gaunt faces. The enemy is time, which flows relentlessly fast. It is winter, which does not retreat. It is empty storerooms that cannot feed the hungry. This is a battle that must be fought not with strength, but with reason, cold blood, and, most terrifyingly, ruthlessness towards one's own people. He opens his eyes, and his gaze falls again on the page listing the rations. Standard rations. The ones that sustained the brothers in earlier, more prosperous times, when there was enough food for everyone, and even some left over. He must cut them. But how? Cut the rations of the warriors who stand watch on the wall, risking their lives every second in the face of an unseen threat that could emerge from the fog at any moment. Then they will be weaker, less alert. Their reactions will slow. Their bodies will not withstand the cold, and the enemy could break through, destroying everything they fight for, the entire world of men. Cut the rations of the builders who repair the damage caused by time and frostbite, restoring what crumbles under the onslaught of the elements. Then the wall will collapse, and the enemy will break through. Cut the rations of the elderly and the sick, those who have already given the best years of their lives to the Night's Watch, who fought and suffered for it, who can no longer hold a sword. It sounds inhuman, cruel. It contradicts all his principles, but they cannot fight, cannot hold the defense. They merely consume precious, dwindling resources. The Night's Watch is not a refuge, but a fortress. But aren't these his people? Didn't he swear to protect them? Doesn't his oath extend to them, to the weak and defenseless? A heavy, insoluble dilemma, each side of which tears his soul apart, leaving only bitterness and despair. Jon's hand, which had been writing neat, clear figures, now trembles as if with a fever, despite the penetrating cold in the room. He feels sweat break out on his forehead. His hardened neck muscles ache from tension. The quill slips from his weakened fingers, falling onto the table, making a faint but distinct tap that echoes in the deafening silence, like a gunshot. He doesn't pick it up immediately. He just sits, numb and drained, staring at a single spot on the cracked table, where every mark reminds him of his heavy burden, at the numbers that seem to mock him with their merciless, unwavering truth. They don't lie. They offer no hope. They merely state a fact, and that fact is a judgment. Imagine you were in his place. What would you do? Is there even a right decision when every choice leads to suffering, when every path is strewn with pain and deprivation, when there is no path without loss? Jon thinks of his vows, of protecting the kingdoms of men from the dangers that lurk beyond the wall, of the Night's Watch being a shield that protects the world of men, and that he, Jon, is now its living embodiment, its last hope. But how can a shield protect if it itself is crumbling from hunger and cold, eaten away from within, as if by a curse? How can he fulfill his duty if his people are dying, not by the blade of the others, but from exhaustion in their own beds, quietly and unnoticed, without a fight? He remembers the old tales told to him in Winterfell, in those times when the world seemed so simple, when this unbearable burden didn't yet exist, about how the wall was built by giants and the first men, about how the Watch was mighty and strong, numbering tens of thousands of brothers, about how they repelled attacks from hundreds of thousands of wildlings, seemingly insurmountable armies. Now, a handful of people, exhausted, hungry, facing certain death every day, yet still not giving up, still performing their duty. They serve without questioning, without expecting rewards, driven only by duty and the last sparks of faith. And he cannot fail them. He cannot, because that would mean the failure of everything he believes in. This sense of duty, this unbreakable obligation, is the only thing that sustains him in these dark times, preventing him from collapsing under the weight. He leans down and picks up the quill. Slowly, with effort, as if it weighs a ton rather than a few grams, as if it is saturated with the entire weight of the world. He dips it into the ink, which feels particularly cold tonight, almost frozen, like congealed tears. And he begins to write new figures, smaller figures, reduced rations, for everyone, without exception. It will be difficult. There will be complaints. There will be discontent. There will be hunger, which will become even sharper, even more agonizing. But it is the only chance, the only way to stretch what remains for as long as possible, for every extra week, every extra day, every extra hour. Every day they can last, every night they can endure, brings them closer to spring, to possible new supplies, to some hope, however fleeting, barely glimmering in the darkness. He knows this is not the end yet. Tomorrow, he will have to decide how to distribute wood to heat the barracks, to warm the brothers' frozen bodies even a little, to prevent them from dying of hypothermia. The day after tomorrow, who will go on patrol in the bitter cold, risking frostbite? Who can withstand this torture of cold and wind? His struggle is an endless series of such micro-decisions, each permeated with the weight of responsibility, each of which could be the last, deciding someone's fate. Sometimes, in such moments, when his strength wanes, Jon looks north, beyond the wall, at the boundless, desolate expanses of ice and snow, where the true, mystical threat lurks, where, it is said, an army of the dead is gathering, relentlessly moving towards them. He knows it is there, that it is real, but it is still out there, invisible, intangible, for now beyond reach. And hunger and cold, they are here, inside, destroying his people from within, slowly but surely, draining their strength and will to resist, making them easy prey. It's an irony of fate, bitter and cruel. Fighting phantoms and the dead might be simpler, for there is a clear enemy, a clear battle. There, everything is clear, either you or them, either victory or death, and then the torment ends. Here, however, it is an endless agony, stretched over time, where every day is a small but exhausting defeat, where victory is ephemeral and quickly fades. A handful of grain. This handful, this remnant, this meager supply, this is what now determines the fate of the Night's Watch, its last days or weeks of existence. Not the legendary battles sung by bards in warm southern halls, not ancient prophecies lost to the ages, not powerful magical forces whispered about in noble castles, but simple, ordinary, yet mortally important things: food, warmth, and the unwavering, stubborn will of one man who refuses to surrender, refuses to admit defeat, even in the face of the inevitable. This is not heroism with a drawn sword, bathed in sunlight, but a quiet, unnoticed, yet far more exhausting burden that he alone carries. This story of Jon Snow, the Lord Commander inventorying provisions, is not just an episode in his life or in the history of the Night's Watch. It is a symbol of the true burden of leadership, its weight and its loneliness when you are left alone with your decisions. A symbol that the most important decisions are not always made on the battlefield to the roar of the crowd, when adrenaline blurs the mind and gives strength. Sometimes they are made in silence, in solitude, to the scratch of a quill, when only numbers and conscience are your sole, merciless interlocutors. It is a story of survival, of its harsh, unglamorous truth, of its invisible heroes, about how heroes not only fight with a sword, but also wage battles with hunger, cold, and despair, with time itself, which works against them. About how every day, every hour, every handful of grain matters, because it is the only path to tomorrow, to a new battle for survival. And that even in the darkest times, when hope seems lost, when gloom gathers around, and it seems light will never return, there are people willing to bear this unbearable burden to protect those who stand behind them, even at the cost of their own soul, their own mind. Jon finally stands, his body protesting against the long sitting. His back aches, his legs are stiff, every muscle sore from tension. He walks to the window, his footsteps echoing hollowly in the empty, cold room, disturbing its peace. Beyond the glass is absolute darkness, only occasionally cut by flashes of lightning from a distant snowstorm, which seems an eternal companion to these lands, never retreating. He sees nothing but his own reflection, vague and tired, yet filled with a strange, unwavering determination. He understands that even if they overcome hunger, even if they survive this winter, the next will inevitably come, and then the next. And the enemy moving from the north will not disappear. It will only retreat for a time, to return with new, even greater force, to finish what it started. This struggle is endless. It is an eternal cycle of sacrifice and survival, to which the Night's Watch is doomed. But now, in this moment, his task is simply to survive this night, and tomorrow, and the day after. One handful of grain at a time, one day at a time. This is his new rallying cry, his new mantra, his new goal. And he is ready to accept this struggle, ready to carry this burden to the end, to his last drop of strength, to his last breath. Because such is the fate of the Lord Commander. Such is the fate of the Night's Watch, which he has taken upon himself. And such is his fate, to be a shield, even if that shield cracks, crumbles, and slowly but surely thins. He returns to the table. He picks up the quill again, his fingers no longer trembling. Now there is a steely resolve in them, forged by the decisions he's made. There is still another scroll to examine. He must take it and start all over again. The list of medical supplies, what remains of healing balms, bandages, rare medicines, and how long they will last. Then, fuel supplies, for cold kills faster than hunger, penetrating to the very souls, and so on, endlessly. Every line, every number, another battle to be won, another decision to be made, not against the others, not against the wildlings, but against relentless, merciless reality that erases all hope and grants no peace. And in this battle, a handful of grain truly decides fate. This, my friends, is where our story draws to a close, but only for a time. For in the world of Westeros, the struggle for survival never ceases, and hardships do not relent. If you found this deep dive into the brutal realities of the Night's Watch compelling, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more immersive stories from Westeros, and let us know in the comments below. What do you think is the true burden of leadership? Until next time, and may your own supply of grain never run out, for survival always depends on the smallest things. Did you know that the deepest stories, the ones that resonate with us on a subconscious level, are often told not through words, but through silent, repetitive actions? Especially when it comes to characters accustomed to hiding their true feelings behind an unyielding wall of cynicism and gruffness, behind a mask of indifference that seems to have fused with their scarred face, becoming a part of their very destiny. Today, we're diving into one such incredibly personal and poignant moment, watching Sandor Clegane, known to the world as the Hound, as he confronts, in solitude, not only fresh bleeding wounds, but also the ghosts of his own harsh past that these wounds inevitably, irrevocably awaken. This isn't just the mechanical treatment of physical injuries. It's a deeply symbolic ritual, forged by decades of brutal existence, every step echoing ancient, unhealed traumas and powerfully symbolizing his relentless, exhausting fight for survival in a world that knows, and has never known, mercy. Imagine a twilight forest, where a battle has just ended, its roars and the clang of steel still ringing in your ears like a painful echo. The sounds of combat have faded, leaving behind only an unsettling, ringing tension in the air. The heavy, damp scent of fresh blood, mixed with the acrid smell of gunpowder, sweat, dust, and the bitter taste of fear that never fully leaves a battlefield, still hangs in the air. The sun has already dipped towards the horizon, painting the western sky in unsettling crimson and orange hues. But for the Hound, this isn't the end of the day or a prelude to deserved rest. It's just another pass on an endless winding road, strewn with pain, disillusionment, and exhaustion. He moves heavily, each step clearly, visibly costing him immense effort. His massive muscles, accustomed to inhuman strains and battles, now tremble from exhaustion, and his movements reveal an undisguised, profound weariness that betrays the true extent of his suffering. He finds a relatively dry spot beneath a sprawling, mighty oak, whose ancient roots, like thick, coiling snakes, intricately intertwine above the ground, forming a sort of shelter. He drops his heavy two-handed sword, his loyal yet merciless companion, beside him, the clang of steel echoing in the encroaching silence, and with a deep groan, he lowers himself to the ground, leaning against the rough, weathered trunk. His massive frame, usually embodying an unyielding, formidable power and a terrifying presence, now appears surprisingly weary, even broken. His shoulders hunched, his head bowed. In this moment, he doesn't resemble the cruel beast everyone is accustomed to fearing and avoiding. A fresh, jagged wound on his left side throbs, each beat of his weary heart echoing with a sharp, searing pain, as if a red-hot coal were pressed against his flesh. His right arm, which he reflexively holds, pressed to his shoulder, is also clearly injured. A crimson, rapidly spreading stain on his once white, now dirty, dusty, and bloodied tunic clearly indicates a deep cut, or perhaps even a stab wound inflicted by a sharp blade. But these fresh injuries are merely the latest in a long, seemingly endless procession of scars and wounds that literally pepper his entire body. Every scar, every ugly, gnarled burn, every deep gash on his skin, it's not just the result of another battle or an accident. It's a separate, painful page of his personal, unbearably cruel history, written by sword, fire, and human malice, etched forever into his flesh. His body is a living, breathing chronicle of violence, a testament to a life where pain became the only constant and healing merely a temporary respite before the next, inevitable trial always lurking around the bend. Before attending to the bleeding wounds that demand immediate attention, he performs a familiar, almost mechanical motion, checking the contents of a small, heavily worn leather pouch he always carries on his massive belt. Inside, a couple of relatively clean, as much as possible in the wild, dusty terrain, rags rolled tightly, a small, plain clay flask of water, meant not for quenching thirst, but for washing, and perhaps a couple of dried herbs, willow bark for pain relief, or plantain leaves, which, as he'd learned from bitter experience, possess weak but effective antiseptic properties. No frills, no expensive salves or medicines available to lords in their luxurious castles and well-equipped infirmaries. Only what can be found, bartered for, or, in a pinch, stolen in the wilderness, relying solely on himself, his wits, and the harsh lessons of survival. He never relied on others for help, and this Spartan arsenal of survival is stark proof of that, screaming of his eternal solitude. His gaze, heavy and bottomlessly weary, falls upon a nearby stream, its gentle gurgle barely audible, its sound seemingly so soothing in the silence. The murky but flowing water is the only thing that can now somewhat alleviate his suffering and cleanse his wounds, giving him a chance to avoid a deadly infection. Rising with a deep groan that betrays the true extent of his fatigue and the pain in every muscle, he slowly, step by step, with utmost caution, reaches the bank. He squats down, his massive body appearing almost fragile in this moment, and first simply dips his dusty, scratch-marked, and dried blood-covered hands into the cool water, allowing it to wash over them. This is the first, almost reflexive act of cleansing, symbolizing the beginning of a ritual repeated countless times throughout his unfortunate life, each time reminding him of the fragility of existence and the inevitability of suffering. The water washes away only the surface grime, but not the all-consuming weariness and pain that has permeated his bones and soul. Then he removes his tunic, heavy, once his protection in battle, but now just a blood-soaked, sweat-drenched rag that clings to his wounds, causing extra torment. His torso is exposed, and it's here that it becomes clear just how much his body is a living map of suffering, each line telling a separate, heartbreaking story. The old, ugly, gnarled burns, left by his brother during his defenseless childhood, look especially sinister in the twilight filtering through the tree canopy, forming a gruesome, permanently distorted mask on one side of his face and extending down his arm and torso like a brand. They are the deepest, most painful part of his identity, an eternal, indelible monument to betrayal and monstrous cruelty inflicted by his closest kin. Beside them are countless scars from swords, daggers, axes, arrows. His skin isn't just an organ, it's a chronicle of survival. Each scar a monument to another battle, another blow of fate that he endured, but which left an indelible, deep imprint, like branded marks of his unhappy destiny. He slowly, almost reluctantly, brings his arrow-pierced arm, the shaft still protruding from his shoulder, to the stream. The arrowhead, fortunately, passed straight through, missing bone and major vessels, but left a wide, deep hole from which blood still oozes. Pain pierces his body like 1,000 searing needles, and for a moment, his usually stone-like, scar-ridden face contorts into a grimace that reveals not only physical agony, but also a profound weariness of pain itself, of its unending, eternal presence in his life. But this grimace vanishes instantly, replaced by his accustomed mask of stoicism, the very one behind which he hid his feelings and vulnerability his entire miserable life, showing no one his true face. He knows this pain. He's acquainted with it like an old, persistent friend who never leaves him alone, always breathing down his neck, reminding him of its existence with every step, every movement, every breath. He has become almost one with this state. The water is cold and stinging at the same time, causing a sharp muscle spasm. He meticulously washes the wound, flushing out dirt, particles of clothing, and blood. This process is long, agonizing, and requires incredible concentration. His fingers, accustomed to gripping a sword hilt and crushing enemies into a bloody pulp, now carefully, almost gently, touch his own ravaged flesh. It's a paradoxical tenderness, born of acute, desperate necessity and the knowledge that no one else will come to his aid. He uses one of the clean rags to carefully wipe the skin around the wound, trying not to introduce new infection, which in these wild conditions could easily cost him his already fragile life. Each breath is taken with great difficulty, his chest rising and falling heavily, emitting a hoarse, broken sound, barely audible in the surrounding silence. This routine, this methodical washing, repeated for decades, speaks volumes of the complete absence of external help, of the harsh school of life that taught him to survive by any means, and of a deep, almost instinctive understanding of his body and its limits. He is his own healer, because others have never been there for him. Meanwhile, hidden behind a dense hawthorn bush, its thorny, tangled branches securely concealing her from prying eyes, his young companion, Arya Stark, watches. She makes no sound, her breathing barely audible, her eyes wide with what she sees. Her eyes, sharp and perceptive like a predator tracking prey, follow the hound's every move with almost hypnotic attention. She had seen him in battle, merciless, deadly, crushing enemies with a single swing of his sword, like a reaper. She had seen him crude, vicious, and frightening, with his endless taunts and threats, behind which cynicism lurked. But this hound, vulnerable and solitary, washing his wounds in a stream like a wild animal, she sees for the first time. There's no bravado in his actions, no display of strength, no attempt to appear as anything other than what he truly is, an exhausted, solitary man. Only weariness, the unbearable weight of existence, and this strange, almost meditative focus on his own body, as if he were performing something sacred. She doesn't know why he evokes this strange feeling in her. Not pity. No. She is too proud for that, and he is not one to inspire pity. Rather, something like an understanding, an involuntary respect for his sheer ability to endure, an acknowledgement that even this monster has his own pain, his own reasons for being the way he is, and his own past that continues to haunt him. She will never admit this aloud, but something within her irrevocably changes in that moment. The hound finishes washing the wound on his shoulder. The water around his hands has already turned a reddish brown, carrying away the remnants of blood and grime, as if the stream is washing away a part of his own ebbing life. He wrings out the rag and presses it to his side, where another, deeper wound is lodged, most likely from a dagger or short sword inflicted in the heat of battle. Blood still oozes from it, staining the stream water a dark red, almost black, symbolizing the wound's depth. He presses the rag tighter, clenching his teeth. The muscles in his face tense, his jawline protrudes, but not a single groan escapes his lips. This silent, internal struggle with pain is the quintessential expression of his character. He never asks for help, never seeks sympathy. He is a lone wolf who licks his wounds away from prying eyes, preferring to suffer in isolation rather than show even a hint of weakness, even a suggestion of human fragility. This ritual is his only confession, his only comfort in a world that has offered him nothing but pain. Once the bleeding lessens slightly, he retrieves a few dried plantain leaves, or perhaps crushed willow bark from his pouch, something that, in his experience, can reduce inflammation and slightly dull the throbbing pain. He rubs them between his fingers, releasing the herbal sap, whose bitter aroma reaches Arya, and carefully applies them to the wound. This isn't medical treatment in the conventional sense. It's more like an ancient survival ritual, passed down through generations among those who live on the edge of human endurance, forced to rely solely on themselves, unable to afford the luxury of a skilled healer or even simple understanding. There's not an ounce of hope for a miracle in his movements, only cold, calculated pragmatism and a belief in the power of nature. bolstered by the bitter experience of countless injuries and their subsequent self-treatment. Then comes the most crucial and methodical process, bandaging. From another clean rag, he tears long, neat strips that look almost like bandages. Clumsily, yet incredibly methodically, with a meticulousness inherent to him, he begins to wrap the wound on his shoulder, then his side. His large, strong hands, accustomed to rough labor, to destruction and inflicting pain, now display surprising precision and care, as if he were a gentle surgeon. He is his own physician, his own medic, and his own patient, all combined in one weary body. Every movement is the result of countless repetitions, every fold of fabric a lesson learned through pain and suffering. How many times has he done this? Hundreds, thousands. With each new injury, with each new scar, this ritual became more refined, almost automatic, instinctive. He isn't aiming for a perfect application, only that it holds tight, only that it protects against dirt and further damage. This isn't about healing. It's about survival, about maintaining the body's functionality so it can continue serving its sole purpose, to move forward, to withstand blows, and to fight until his last breath. This routine, this repetitive act of self-treatment, reveals more about his past than any words spoken by him, or about him by anyone else. He had never been someone cared for, someone who could count on support and tenderness. His brother, Gregor, the Mountain, was the source of his deepest traumas, both physical and emotional, not healing or comfort. His family, his lord, his king, no one offered him true care or healing. They merely used him as a tool. He had always been alone with his pain, both physical and emotional, with the constant searing of his burns and the cold echo of betrayal that haunted him his entire life. This ritual isn't just wound dressing. It's an affirmation of his solitary, brutal path. It's an act of resilience, forged and solidified by decades of neglect, cruelty, and the constant need to fight for his place in the sun, for every new day. He isn't just healing himself. He's reaffirming his independence, his defiance of fate, his right to exist against all odds. Arya continues to watch, her posture tense, but her gaze fixed on him, as if mesmerized. She sees not just a man bandaging his wounds. She sees a man so accustomed to pain that it has become an integral part of him, his second nature, deeply ingrained in his flesh and soul. And this habit wasn't born overnight. It's the result of constant blows, betrayals, and survival in a world that offered him nothing but cruelty and continuous challenges. In these moments, as he is so vulnerable, as his mask of gruffness slips slightly, she catches glimpses of something human beneath the Hound's armor. Not love, not kindness. No, more like a deep, unwavering weariness and a surprising ability to withstand what would break many, reduce them to dust. This scene, this silent ballet of pain and patience, imprints itself forever on her memory, shaping her own perception of survival and resilience, teaching her unexpected lessons. He finally finishes. The bandages appear rough, but sturdy, securely fastening his wounds, as if by his own will. He drops heavily back to the ground, leaning against the tree trunk, and closes his eyes. Weariness descends upon him with its full weight, pressing him to the ground, draining his last reserves of strength, siphoning energy from every cell. His breathing becomes steady, but still heavy, each exhale like a released burden of everything lived, every suffering he has ever experienced. A deep, pervasive silence hangs in the air, broken only by the rustle of leaves overhead, as if the forest whispers ancient secrets and the distant, drawn-out cry of a night bird, which sounds as solitary as he himself. This moment of silent suffering, this ritual of self-care, is key to understanding Sandor Clegane. He isn't a knight in shining armor, not a hero of ballads who fights for a just cause, but in his capacity to endure pain, in his solitary fortitude, there is a harsh, almost primal beauty and power. He is a product of the world that created him, brutal, merciless, yet incredibly resilient, unbroken, despite everything, defying all blows of fate. And each time he bandages his wounds, he not only mends his flesh, but also strengthens his will, tempers his spirit, preparing for the next battle, which will surely come, because his life is an unbroken chain of battles, an endless cycle of violence and survival. He doesn't seek peace. He merely strives to survive within it, on his own harsh terms. And Arya, watching him from the shadows, inadvertently learns something profound. She learns to survive in a world that tolerates no weakness and demands constant struggle. She learns the resilience displayed by this man, her captor, an unwilling companion, in whom she begins to see something more than just a monster. She learns that pain isn't an end, but a part of the journey that makes you stronger if you can endure it and keep going. She sees in him a reflection of her own, perhaps not yet as deep, but already forming ability to accept the cruelty of the world and continue moving forward, even when it seems all is lost and there is no hope. This ritual isn't just a scene from a life. It's a lesson conveyed without words, a profound message about resilience, about a person's ability to withstand everything fate throws at them, and to find the strength to rise again, time after time. And this story, told in silence, through the ritual of wound care that has become a part of his life, often proves far louder and more piercing than any confession, any heroic ballad, because it speaks to the very essence of the human spirit, its capacity to endure in the face of unimaginable trials, and how the past shapes our present. If you found this deep dive into character fascinating, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more analyses, and let us know in the comments below what other silent stories you've noticed in your favorite characters. Winterfell wasn't just silent. It was a silence thick and heavy, like the wet snow, piling layer upon layer on the castle walls, burying voices, laughter, and songs. This silence was alive, breathing frosty air through broken windows, seeping under doors, settling as frost on the stone floors. In every breath of it, you could feel something alien, something wrong. The castle stood, its ancient stones remembering the Starks, but its soul had been ripped out, replaced by a cold, calculating fear. The wind whipping through the courtyard no longer carried the scent of hearth smoke and fresh bread. It brought the smell of rust and stale blood. But even in this dead atmosphere, at its very core, something else flickered, a barely perceptible movement, an invisible trace of an unfinished journey, as if someone had set out long ago and never returned. But the echo of their footsteps still lingered in the air, promising that the story wasn't over. It was a premonition, a subtle vibration in the frozen air, a feeling that beneath the thick ice, a river still flowed, waiting for its moment to break through. In the corridors, where foreign boots now trod, lingered an unsaid truth, a silent question hanging in the gloom. Something had been long forgotten, but not entirely lost. The breath of this forgotten past was almost imperceptible, yet it was there, like the warmth the earth holds beneath deep snow. In a small, drafty room, high in one of the towers, a single candle flickered. Its flame was the only living, warm spot in this realm of cold and stone. It danced, pulling thin fingers, a focused face, and heavy fabric lying on a lap from the darkness. Sansa sat on a low bench, shoulders hunched to ward off the bone-chilling cold. Her movements were slow, measured, almost ritualistic. She wasn't embroidering, an art she'd been taught since childhood, where every stitch was meant to create beauty and elegance. Now her hands were busy with coarse, almost masculine work. She was mending an old travel cloak. This cloak had lain in a chest for decades, imbued with the scent of dust, roads, and campfire smoke. Its dark gray wool was rough and prickly, the wolf fur collar matted and sparse, and the hem bore old mud stains that even years couldn't wash out. In several places, the fabric was worn almost to holes. This wasn't just a garment, it was an artifact, a silent witness to hundreds of leagues traversed under the northern sky. Her fingers, accustomed to fine silk and satin, now struggled to push the thick needle through the unyielding wool. She wasn't restoring it for beauty. This was an act akin to restoring memory, patching holes in her own soul. Each stitch was a small act of care, preparation for something insignificantly important that might never happen. She was preparing this cloak for a journey, not knowing where or when that journey might begin. The movements of her hands were meditative. The needle dove into the fabric, emerged, leaving a dark thread like a scar. This rhythm soothed, grounded her, brought her back into her own body, which so often felt alien within these walls. She was drying this cloak by the faint fire of her soul, untangling the knots of the past, weaving hope for the future into it. The touch of the rough wolf fur on the collar was like a needle prick, not to her finger, but directly to her heart. Suddenly, brightly, and painfully, a memory surfaced. It wasn't connected to some grand event or adventure. It was just a moment, a fragment of a long-gone world. She was about 10, maybe 11. Outside Winterfell, a blizzard howled, burying the courtyard up to the battlements. She stood beside her father by the great fireplace in the main hall. Lord Eddard had just returned from surveying the lands, and his cloak carried that very scent. The smell of snow, melted water, cold leather, and something undefinably familiar, the smell of the north itself. He placed a heavy, gloved hand on her shoulder, and through her thin dress, she felt the weight and warmth of that hand, and the stiffness of the fur brushing her cheek. In that moment, she didn't feel delight or any special joy. She felt something much deeper and more fundamental, absolute, unbreakable safety. The feeling that as long as this cloak and this hand were near, no blizzard, no trouble in the world could reach her. She didn't remember the words he spoke then, but the emotion of the moment itself, an all-consuming sense of home, belonging to something great and eternal, like the very walls of Winterfell. She was a part of it, small but inseparable. And now, running her fingers over the matted cold fur, she tried to resurrect not the event itself, but that feeling. The feeling of protection that had been so cruelly and so long ago taken from her. The weariness of the long journey she had made since then weighed down on her anew, and for a moment she felt like that little girl again, clinging to her father, seeking refuge from the cold and fear. The memory melted away as suddenly as it appeared, leaving behind only a bitter aftertaste and a ringing emptiness. The warmth of her father's hand on her shoulder was replaced by the real, pervasive cold of the stone room. The needle in her fingers froze. She lifted her head and listened. The castle was quiet, but this silence no longer seemed like merely an absence of sound. Now, it was filled with shadows of the past and threats of the present. Every rustle outside the door, every creak of a floorboard in the corridor resonated within her like a dull thud of her heart. This was the shadow of her long adventure, the consequence of all her losses and betrayals. A scar that didn't ache constantly, but throbbed with every change in weather, every careless movement. She perceived her situation not as a temporary inconvenience, but as a prolonged torture of waiting. She waited for a scream, a knock at the door, rough voices that would shatter this fragile moment of peace. This had become a habit, a part of her existence. She always woke up at night from the slightest sound that wasn't the usual howl of the wind or the crackle of the candle. The distant barking of dogs from the kennels, once a background sound of her childhood, now sounded like a harbinger of pursuit. The footsteps of a guard on the wall, measured and monotonous, seemed to her like a countdown to some inevitable climax. The weariness she carried wasn't physical. It was a weariness of the soul, exhausted by constant tension, the need to wear a mask of obedience and indifference. And now, in the silence of her room, this weariness pressed down on her like a leaden weight. She was a prisoner again, and mending the old cloak seemed both an act of defiance and a bitter reminder of how far she was from freedom. She was almost done patching the largest tear on the hem when her fingers brushed against something hard, sewn into the lining. It was small, flat. Her heart skipped a beat. She froze, catching her breath, and began carefully, with her fingernail, to unpick the lining seam at that spot. Her movements became feverish, but quiet. The candle cast her huge, distorted shadow on the wall, which seemed to live its own life, mimicking her movements with ominous precision. Finally, the lining gave way, and onto her palm fell a tiny, almost weightless object. It wasn't a coin or a stone. It was a lock of hair, tied with a faded blue thread, a few dark red strands, exactly like her mother's, and a few, almost black, like her father's. They were braided together, forming a tiny plait, a symbol of a union that could not be broken. She didn't know who had done it or when. Perhaps Lady Catelyn herself, sewing a piece of herself and their home into her husband's cloak before one of his long journeys. Perhaps old Nan did it, believing in the power of such charms. She would never know. But this discovery wasn't just an object. It was a sign, a trace left not for her, but found by her at the most opportune moment. It was a hidden event that changed everything. Until this moment, mending the cloak had been an act of nostalgia, a quiet protest. Now it became something more. It became a continuation of tradition, a taking of the torch. This cloak wasn't just clothing. It was a repository of memory, a family heirloom. And now she was its keeper. She didn't cry out, didn't weep. She sat absolutely still, gazing at the tiny lock of hair in her palm. In the dim candlelight, she imagined she saw not just the silhouette of her shadow on the wall, but the shadow of a woman of House Stark, straight and unyielding. This was the beginning of a real, internal movement. She observed this feeling, rising within her, not daring yet to give it free rein, but already knowing that the point of no return had been crossed. She carefully squeezed the discovery in her fist. The warmth of her palm seemed to bring these dry strands of hair to life, and with that warmth, a storm rose in her soul. She weighed everything on invisible scales. On one side was her life here, in this cold, hostile Winterfell. A life full of fear and humiliation, but still life. She had learned to survive, learned to be inconspicuous, to say what others wanted to hear, to smile when she wanted to scream. This was peace, albeit the peace of a swamp that slowly sucks you to the bottom. To stay here, to continue playing her role, to wait for fate to decide her destiny, that was the safe path. On the other side was the pull towards another path, a call she had just heard so clearly. This call came from the old cloak, from the lock of hair in her hand, from the memory of her father's hand on her shoulder. It was the call of blood, the call of her name. To walk this path meant risking everything, not just risking being caught mending a forbidden symbol, risking raising her head, straightening her shoulders, remembering who she truly was. It meant ceasing to be a victim and becoming a Stark of Winterfell again. This struggle was quiet, invisible to outside eyes. The desire to stay, to hide in her small room, in her learned obedience, fought with an almost forgotten desire to act, to fight, to reclaim what was rightfully hers. She remembered everything she had been through, the loss of her family, Joffrey's cruelty, the intrigues of King's Landing, Littlefinger's betrayal. Every scar on her soul screamed caution, but every drop of Stark blood flowing in her veins whispered of duty and honor. She sat in silence, and only her clenched fist betrayed the tension, that inner storm raging within her. Her choice was made, but it wasn't a choice that could be seen or heard. She wasn't going to throw the cloak over her shoulders and defiantly walk through the castle corridors. The time for that had not yet come. Her rebellion would remain silent. She carefully, with a tenderness she hadn't felt in a very long time, put the lock of hair back into the lining and sewed up the slit with a few quick but strong stitches. Now, the cloak's secret was her secret too. Finishing her work, she slowly and carefully folded the cloak. First the sleeves, then the flaps, until it became a dense, heavy bundle. She put it back at the bottom of the chest, under a pile of old linens, where no one would think to look for it. This gesture was a farewell, but a temporary one. A farewell to this moment of revelation, to this impulse. She wasn't extinguishing the candle flame. She was extinguishing the flame of open defiance, hiding it deep within, so it would warm her, but not burn too soon. She wrapped herself in her thin blanket, but this wasn't just an act to get warm. She seemed to be listening to herself, to the new strength that had awakened within her. She was staying. For now. She had made the choice not to go, but internally, she was already ready for the journey. Every subsequent step, every word, every smile would now have a different meaning. They would be part of a long, patient game, the goal of which only she knew. She extinguished the candle, and the room plunged into almost absolute darkness. But for her, this darkness was no longer hostile. Now, hidden within it, was her own little secret, her own little hope. In the darkness and silence of the room, she lay awake, staring at the unseen ceiling. The cold began to creep under the blanket again, but now it didn't seem so all-powerful. Somewhere, at the bottom of the old chest, lay the mended cloak, holding the warmth of her hands and the secret of her family. It was her silent banner, her invisible armor. She didn't know when the day would come, when she could take it out and throw it over her shoulders without hiding. Perhaps such a day would never come. Or perhaps it was closer than it seemed. She slowly reached out from under the blanket and ran her fingertips across her palm, over the spot where the tiny braid of her parents' hair had just lain. Her skin still held the phantom sensation of that touch. And in that frozen silence, in the very heart of the enemy's lair, she understood that one stitch made in the dark could be stronger than 1,000 swords drawn in the sun. Next time the opportunity arises, perhaps she will be ready. If you found this journey through Sansa's quiet strength compelling, hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more deep dives into the world of Westeros. Have you ever felt that profound calm right before everything changes? That's what the night felt like descending on Winterfell. It wasn't a dark shroud, but a sea holding its breath. The air, crisp and clean, hung still between the castle's gray stone walls, and the silence that settled upon it wasn't empty, but full. It was composed of 1,000 subtle sounds, weaving into a single, calming melody of home. This silence was alive. It remembered the laughter of children in the yard, the clang of steel on the training ground, the creak of gates, letting riders in and out. But this evening, something else permeated it. It was as if all paths, leading to and from the castle, were momentarily erased from the world's map, and Winterfell itself hung in timelessness. There was something fragile, almost unnatural, about this piece, like a long exhale before an inevitable word that would change everything. The ancient stones seemed to listen to this silence, awaiting the distant thud of hooves or the cry of a raven that hadn't yet left its nest hundreds of leagues away. A premonition hung in the air, not of disaster, but of an ending. The ending of something so long and familiar that no one even remembered its beginning. Snow, swirling slowly, settled on roofs and battlements, and its every quiet rustle was a note in this lullaby for a world that would never be the same. The paths were empty, but they waited. They waited for steps not yet taken, for messengers not yet sent, for an army still sleeping peacefully in their homes. This night was the last page in a book no one hurried to finish, instinctively sensing that the next chapter was written in a different hand altogether. In his room, lit only by the flickering flames of a large hearth, sat Robb Stark. The warmth from the fire was thick and palpable, chasing away the cold that perpetually lived in the North's stone masonry. The young lord, whose shoulders were beginning to broaden with manhood, and whose mother's blue eyes now held his father's steadfastness, was absorbed in a slow, almost ritualistic task. He wasn't reading dispatches or studying maps, though a stack of scrolls lay neatly on the edge of the heavy oak table. Instead, Robb methodically, inch by inch, cleaned his hunting gloves of thick deer hide. They had traversed dozens of leagues with him through forests and fields, endured both summer downpours and winter blizzards. One of them bore a dark, old stain, the mark of a missed shot and a long chase. Robb slowly drew an oiled cloth over the toughened leather, rubbing in a mixture of wax and fat. His movements were measured and calm, devoid of youthful impulsiveness. In this simple act was a tribute to the path already traveled and a silent preparation for what still lay ahead, even if it was just tomorrow's hunt in the wolf's wood. The fire in the hearth crackled, and the shadows of Robb's hands danced on the wall, transforming his figure into the silhouette of an ancient king preparing for a campaign. Nearby, curled into a massive gray ball, slept his direwolf, Grey Wind. His flanks rose and fell rhythmically, and in his sleep he sometimes twitched his paws, as if running through the endless snowfields of his wolf dreams. Robb finished with one glove, set it aside, and took the other. He wasn't in a hurry. In this room, in this castle, Time flowed differently, slowly and thickly, like sap on ancient pines. He inhaled the familiar scents: hearth smoke, wax, leather, and the faint, wild musk of the sleeping beast. These were the scents of his home, his world, and in this quiet hour, they seemed as immutable as Winterfell's very walls. Every movement was part of a ritual of return, of grounding himself after a long day spent in the saddle. He was restoring order to his belongings, and with that, to his thoughts, allowing the castle's silence to envelop him like a warm cloak. As the wax settled evenly on the second glove, Robb's fingers paused for a moment, touching a small, almost imperceptible scar on his index finger knuckle. This mark was left by a branch that had lashed his hand many years ago, during one of his first serious excursions into the Wolf's Wood. The memory surged not in images, but in sensations, as clear as the fire's warmth on his skin. He felt again that bone-chilling cold of early morning, when fog lay so thick on the ground it seemed you could cut it with a knife. He remembered the oppressive silence of the ancient forest, where even the crunch of a twig underfoot sounded deafeningly loud. He, his father, Lord Eddard Stark, and Theon Greyjoy were then tracking an old, solitary boar. Theon was full of eagerness and impatience. His whisper seemed too loud to Robb, disturbing the forest's stillness. And his father, as always, was calm and focused, moving almost silently, his figure in a dark cloak, almost blending with the shadows of the trees. Robb didn't remember the thrill of the chase or the triumph of a successful strike. He remembered the feeling of overwhelming loneliness that gripped him when he fell a few minutes behind his father and Theon. The forest closed around him, vast, indifferent, ancient. Ancient trees, covered in moss, watched him like silent giants. And in that moment, he, the future warden of the North, felt incredibly small and vulnerable. He felt the weight of his father's gaze, even when he couldn't see him, felt the burden of expectations. It wasn't the joyful fatigue after a long ride, but a dull, sucking emptiness of a person walking a path he hadn't chosen, but one that was destined for him. It was then, as he pushed through the thick undergrowth, that he received that scar. The pain was sharp but brief, and it brought him back to reality. He found his father by barely discernible tracks, and Lord Eddard said nothing, only nodded, and in that nod was everything: silent approval, understanding, and recognition that his son had just passed another tiny but important lesson. The emotion of that moment, not fear, but a cold, clear realization of his place in this vast, harsh world, stayed with Robb forever, sealed in the small, whitish scar on his hand. Robb Stark blinked, and the vision of the forest dissipated, giving way to the familiar outlines of his room. The fire's shadows still danced on the walls, and outside the window, snow fell quietly. But the chill of that distant morning seemed to have permeated the room for a moment, making him shiver. He rubbed his numb knuckle. The scar no longer hurt, but it was there, a constant reminder that the world beyond Winterfell's walls was always near, breathing cold and anticipation. It wasn't a threat, but simply a given, the shadow of his future destiny, following him relentlessly. He always felt it, like a slight chill in a warm room, like a sudden silence in the middle of a feast, like a sound only he could hear. Every night, as he fell asleep, he subconsciously listened for the faint creak of the main gate's hoisting mechanism. Even when they were tightly locked and guarded, that sound seemed to live a life of its own in the old wood and iron. He always woke if the creak was slightly louder than usual, his heart momentarily stopping in anticipation. A messenger? News? But then silence returned, and he knew it was just the old castle sighing in its sleep. This habit was born long ago and became part of him. He felt tired, but not the fatigue that comes after a day of physical labor. This was a deep weariness of the soul, one that is always on guard, bearing the weight of responsibility for everyone sleeping within these walls. He looked at Grey Wind. The direwolf slept, but his ears twitched slightly, catching every rustle in the castle. In this, they were alike. Both were guardians of this peace, and both felt its fragility. Robb rose and walked to the tall arched window. The glass was cold to the touch. Below lay the snow-covered courtyard, bathed in the pale moonlight piercing through the clouds. Everything was quiet and calm. But the shadow of adventure, the shadow of duty, the shadow of the great world breathed very close, beyond the thin barrier of stone and glass. And he waited, not knowing for what. He simply waited, because to be a Stark of Winterfell means to always wait. Gazing into the serene picture of the courtyard, where snow covered all irregularities and smoothed out sharp edges, Robb noticed something strange. For a fraction of a second, in the farthest and darkest corner, at the foot of the old, crumbling first keep, something gleamed. It wasn't the moon's reflection off ice, nor the glint of a guard's torch. The light was dim, greenish, and somehow oily. It flickered and immediately died, as if someone had momentarily opened a lantern door with a sooty glass, then slammed it shut again. Robb froze, his palm still resting on the cold glass. He squinted, trying to discern any movement in that darkness, but there was nothing, just the steady curtain of falling snow and the motionless shadows of the walls. His heart skipped a beat. This was wrong. No one was supposed to be in that corner of the castle. Guards took a different route, and servants were too afraid to approach the old tower after dark, whispering stories of ancient kings' ghosts. The thought of shouting for the guard flickered and then died. What would he tell them? That he imagined a flicker of light. They would laugh at him. At that very moment, as if confirming his own unease, Grey Wind by the hearth raised his head. The fur on his hackles bristled, and a low, guttural growl rumbled from his chest. The direwolf wasn't looking out the window. His huge, intelligent eyes, the color of molten gold, were fixed on the room's door, leading to the corridor. He had heard or smelled something that was already inside the castle. Robb slowly withdrew his hand from the window. He didn't move from his spot, becoming an observer. He felt no fear, rather, an icy curiosity and a pang of unease. This was that hidden event, a tiny pebble that once set rolling could cause an avalanche. He didn't understand what it meant, but he instinctively felt it. This was the beginning of some movement, a disruption of the familiar order of things. The peace of this night was pierced by a thin needle of the unknown, and the silence in the room became tense, ringing. He just stood there, staring into the darkness, and beside him, his dire wolf quietly growled at an invisible enemy. The struggle within Robb was quiet but fierce. One part of him, raised by his father, the part of the future lord, demanded immediate action. He should wake Sir Roderick Castle, rouse a dozen guards, and scour every dark corner of the castle. His duty was to protect Winterfell from any threat, real or imagined. The thought of an unknown presence within his home's walls was like poison. He imagined himself descending the echoing stone staircases, the clang of steel, the echo of his commands reverberating through the sleeping castle. There was risk in this, but there was also the certainty of action, a call he was accustomed to answering. This part of his soul yearned for the path, for a solution, for moving forward. But his other half, the one that had absorbed the warmth of the hearth and the smell of fresh bread from the bakeries, desperately clung to the peace. He remembered how, just hours ago, he had sat at dinner in the great hall. He saw his mother, Lady Catelyn, smile as she watched Rickon trying to feed his direwolves meat under the table. He heard Bran's quiet, fascinated account of his latest climb up one of the walls. He saw Arya teasing Sansa, and Sansa pretending not to notice, maintaining her impeccable lady's composure. He remembered his father's calm, slightly weary gaze, which seemed to encompass them all at once, finding his greatest strength in that sight. All of this was here, now, within the walls of this room. This fragile, precious world that he could shatter with a single worry. What if it was just a trick of the light, or a stray cat knocking something over in the yard? By raising the alarm, he would introduce fear into their world, disturb the sleep of his brothers and sisters, make his mother worry. He weighed safety and peace on an invisible scale. On one side lay duty, on the other, tenderness for his family, and for this last quiet hour. He remembered his father's words, that a lord's true strength lies not in wielding a sword, but in knowing when to keep that sword sheathed. And the urge to act, to move, began to yield to the desire to preserve this moment, to prolong it for at least one more night. Robb Stark took a deep breath, and the decision came to him. Not tonight. Not this night. He slowly moved away from the window, consciously turning his back on the mystery lurking in the courtyard. This gesture wasn't a retreat, but a choice. He chose warmth, not cold. He chose silence, not the shouts of guards. He chose the peaceful sleep of his family, not his own anxiety. He walked to the large armchair by the fire where he had been sitting, and his gaze fell on the stack of scrolls on the table. There were stewards' reports, requests from minor lords, a census of grain stores. Tomorrow. All that would be tomorrow. Tonight, he would allow himself the luxury of being not a future lord, but simply an elder son in his home. He approached the hearth and picked up the heavy poker. With a few sure movements, he stirred the dying embers, sending up a shower of sparks. The flames leaped higher, brighter, and the room filled with a new, living light. Shadows retreated to the farthest corners. This simple gesture was full of symbolism. He wasn't extinguishing the light, but making it stronger, as if trying to protect this small island of warmth from the encroaching darkness. Then Robb knelt before Grey Wind. The direwolf had stopped growling, but his body remained tense. Robb ran his fingers through the thick, coarse fur on his neck, scratching behind his ears. He said nothing, but the beast understood everything. Under his master's hand, the wolf's muscles gradually relaxed, and he let out a soft, sigh-like sound, burying his huge head in Robb's knee. This silent dialogue was a farewell to anxiety. Robb wrapped himself in this moment of peace, like the warmest fur cloak, temporarily shutting out the entire world. He glanced at the dark window once more, but now without unease, rather with quiet resolve. He had made the decision to stay, not to go, but somewhere deep down, he was ready. Ready for this night to end, and for dawn to break. He didn't go to bed. Instead, Robb sat back in the armchair, pulling a heavy wool blanket over his legs. He had no intention of sleeping. He wanted to sit through this night, to absorb its silence, to remember every detail. The fire in the hearth burned steadily and strongly, casting warm flickers on his young, serious face. Grey Wind had dozed off again at his feet, but now his sleep was light, intermittent. The castle was silent, but this silence was no longer calming. It now held a knowing of a strange light in the darkness, of a dire wolf's low growl, of the peace that could be shattered at any moment. Robb watched the flames and thought. He thought not of ghosts or enemies. He thought of how many more such quiet nights his home was allotted. How many more times would he be able to sit like this, listening to the crackle of logs and the breath of his wolf, feeling completely safe within these walls? The question remained unanswered, hanging in the warm air of the room. He didn't know that beyond the window, hundreds of leagues to the south, a messenger was already riding with a letter that would seal the fate of his father and their entire house. He didn't know that this quiet snowfall was the last peaceful snowfall he would see in his home castle. He only felt that something had irrevocably changed. Perhaps he would check that dark corner tomorrow morning. Or perhaps the bustle of a new day would consume him, and the strange flicker would be forgotten, remaining only a vague memory. But something told him that the next time darkness brought with it a mystery, he would no longer have a choice, to stay or to go. Next time, the path would find him. For now, there was only this night, the last quiet night in peaceful Winterfell. If this journey into the heart of Winterfell captivated you as much as it did me, please hit that like button. Subscribe for more deep dives into the lore of your favorite worlds, and let me know in the comments what parts of this story resonated most with you.